It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt are both professors of government at Harvard University. Levitsky's research focuses on Latin America and the developing world. Ziblatt studies Europe from the 19th century to the present. Their new book is called How Democracies Die. While they didn't expect to address the breakdown of democracy in the United States, that changed when Trump was elected. Levitsky and Ziblatt both provide a provocative analysis of the parallels between Donald Trump's ascent and the fall of other democracies, building on their December 2016 New York Times op-ed, which asked, "Is Donald Trump a threat to democracy?" They emphatically answer yes. They outline the specific risks he poses and chart ways we can avert the threat of authoritarianism. Drawing on examples of troubled states from around the world, Levitsky and Ziblatt point out that warning signs of collapse include the weakening of institutions, such as the judiciary and the media, erosion of political norms, and the rise of incivility. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt to Politics and Prose. Thank you.
Wonderful to be here tonight. I'm Daniel Ziblatt. This is Stephen Levitsky. We're going to tag team tonight. I'm going to start by talking for a few minutes, then I'll hand things over to Steve. So it is great to be here and to see such a great crowd. Our book just came out last week. And I wanted to begin this evening by just saying a few words about the motivation, why we wrote this book. So as mentioned, Steve and I teach together in the government department at Harvard. And we worked closely and taught together over the last 15 years, researched very similar topics. We both study democracies in crisis around the world. I study European politics. Steve has mostly studied Latin American politics, but we have not really focused our research and our teaching on the United States. But we were really motivated to write this book because, like many of you perhaps, over the course of the 2015-2016 election, we kind of watched what was happening in the United States. We had this sense of uneasiness at first, and growing shock at the tenor of the political debate. So this book was really born literally in the halls of our department as we would have these conversations in the hall. And we had spent much of our lives, as I said, studying democratic breakdown in other parts of the world. Again, me in Europe mostly, and Steve mostly in Latin America. And so like all of you, that we had a sense of fear and kind of trepidation about what was happening, but there was another layer of trepidation because of what we had studied. And at first, really, it was just the small echoes. In 2016, the Republican presidential candidate railed against the media. We've all seen all of this in unprecedented ways. He refused to say he would necessarily abide by the results of elections. He threatened to lock up his political rival if elected. And he worked crowds into frenzies. And we've seen videos of these, if you didn't attend the rallies, of condoning violence. So this was very frightening to lots of people. This is very frightening to lots of people, to us as well. A lot of people thought these were just words, but Steve and I recognized in all of this that these were the clear hallmarks of an authoritarian. No major party presidential candidate in American 20th century history had ever behaved this way. But many candidates who eventually become authoritarian leaders elsewhere in the world do behave this way. So both of us had this uncanny feeling that we had seen this movie before in other places, and we knew it usually didn't end well. So we decided we really had to write this book. We wanted to draw upon the knowledge we have of other countries where democracy facing these kinds of challenges had overcome these challenges, and other places where democracy facing these kinds of challenges did not overcome these challenges. So while working on the book and researching the book and writing the book, we came to a conclusion, though, that I think departs from how many think about the Trump presidency today. We came to the conclusion the problem facing our political system is not Donald Trump alone. It's not just his outrageous comments. It's not just his psychology that people try to understand. It's tempting to focus on the latest outrageous tweet or political gossip. But at some level, this is a distraction. We think it's important to keep your eye on the ball. At the end of the day, we came to realize that Donald Trump was not just a cause of America's current predicament. He was in many ways a symptom. He was a symptom of deeper, worrying ills that run through the American political system. In short, we realized that the problem runs deeper than Donald Trump. So tonight, Steve and I will talk to you about 3 discoveries we made in the process of writing this book that led us to this conclusion that the problem lies deeper than Trump. And we'll sketch out for you some of what we think are the most important points, and we'll kind of elaborate this all, that we elaborate more fully in the book. Okay, so I'm going to start off by talking about the first discovery, and Steve's going to talk about the second and thirds. So discovery number one. Discovery number one is this. The best way to stop authoritarians is to prevent them from coming to power in the first place. Okay, so what does this mean, really? Well, in the context of the United States, this means we have to pay attention to not just why Donald Trump was elected, but also why he ever became the nominee of one of our two major political parties in the first place. So let me elaborate. In the Cold War, 3/4 of democratic breakdowns around the world happened at the hands of men with guns in the form of military coups. Since the collapse of communism, most democratic breakdowns now arrive at the ballot box through elections. Demagogues come to power, and once in power, through elections, and once in power, they usually inflict serious damage on democratic institutions. So a grave paradox, if you kind of think about this for a moment, facing democracies today, is how does a democracy prevent an autocratic-minded demagogue from getting elected in the first place? Now, through most of American history, we've happily avoided this paradox, but it was not because there was a kind of absence of demagogues or an absence of people who might support demagogues. In fact, we kind of have a tendency, I think, to whitewash our own history and to forget that there's really a continuous strand of would-be authoritarians who generally gain around 30% approval support in opinion surveys. So this strand runs from Henry Ford in the 1920s, the founder of Ford Auto Company, a vocal and extremely popular anti-Semite who was actually quoted in Mein Kampf, who considered running for president in the 1920s. Huey Long in the 1930s, Joe McCarthy in the 1950s, George Wallace in the 1960s. So Gallup poll data actually exists going back to the 1930s. And for each of these figures, you see around roughly 35% approval ratings for each of these figures. And this is a continuous figure that runs all the way up to around 35% approval for our current president. So I don't think it's actually too much to say that there's a continuous strand of authoritarianism running as a subcurrent in American political culture. But here's the point. None of these figures I just mentioned ever made it close to the presidency. Though they were popular, they're kept far from power. So the question is how, and what changed in 2016? So in our book, we emphasize two contributing factors that we describe more fully, but I'll kind of just highlight them for you this evening. First, the way we picked presidents has changed. Until 1972 in America, the first 3/4 of the 20th century, Democratic or presidential candidates were selected by party leaders, and what some political scientists have called a kind of system of peer review. So party leaders who worked closely with politicians, who saw politicians in moments of crisis and moments of triumph, worked with them on a daily basis. These were the guys who got together and decided who the candidates were. This was a system often criticized, rightly, as smoke-filled back rooms, where party leaders would get together and choose the candidates, and voters were basically irrelevant. Voters mattered, of course, in general elections, but their primaries were not binding. Most states didn't have them. It was party leaders who picked candidates. Again, this system, the smoke-filled back room, has a lot to criticize about it. It had some downsides. It was exclusive. It wasn't very democratic. And sometimes some mediocre and very bland candidates emerged out of this. Warren G. Harding is the kind of prototype of this, 1924, who emerged and, is somebody who was not an impressive president. But this system had its downsides. But all systems have advantages and disadvantages. And the advantages of this system was that it worked quite well, in fact, perfectly, in keeping extremists from ever becoming viable candidates at the top of the ticket for office in the first place. So it was a screening system, a filtration system. Now, we all know American life changed in many profound ways in the tragic year of 1968. And it was a tragic year in American history. But it also changed in the way we select our presidential candidates. The presidential candidate selection system after 1968 was opened up. The smoke-filled rooms were opened. Primaries were made binding. Voters could now select their candidates. And general election was now preceded by a long, continuous primary season where voters had a say. And we all know this system. Now, this system was certainly more open. But two political scientists in the early 70s warned that the fall of the filtration system could also open the door to demagogues. Now, to be clear, we don't advocate going back to the old system. But at the same time, we have to recognize the current system is double-edged. In this new system, if a demagogue ever ran for office, the road was much clearer for him or her. It's true the Democrats in the 1980s introduced a system of superdelegates, so elected officials who carried extra weight, which contained some of the elements of the old system. But Republicans never adopted this. They never adopted a system of superdelegates. So this left the door open. This meant that if a demagogue ever decided to run for president, especially in the Republican Party, without superdelegates, there was much more open road for him. And this is exactly what happened in 2016. Donald Trump, a modern-day demagogue, became the nominee of the Republican Party. But there's a second factor we also elaborate in the book. In some ways, I think we both think this is a more important factor. And this is a second factor which cleared the way for the rise of Donald Trump. Because even after Donald Trump won the nomination, he could have been defeated by Hillary Clinton. That's certainly true. But almost as importantly, there was an absolutely imperative role to be played by the Republican Party allies. So here's really the central pivot of this part of our story. Authoritarians come to power not on their own, but with the enabling aid of political allies from the political establishment. So that throughout history, this repeats itself. From Italy in the 1920s, Germany in the 1930s, Latin America in the 1990s. This is really a crucial test. When demagogues who clearly violate democratic norms get close to power, one of the last off-ramps is whether or not establishment politicians, party allies, finally break with the demagogue, or the autocrat in the making. Do they draw a line in the sand and say, beyond this we will not go? Or do they abdicate? Do they overlook the democratic violations? They let party trump country and commitment to democratic norms, and in effect form a Faustian bargain, allowing their ideological ally, but who may be an autocrat in the making, into power? Do they enable the authoritarian? So when elected autocrats get into power at this last stage, it's nearly always because mainstream politicians, out of miscalculation or opportunism, let them in the door. The enabling role of the Republican Party is not actually unique. This happens remarkably often. So in Venezuela, and we recount this in the book, in Venezuela in the 1990s, Hugo Chavez got his political start by being given a big boost from a long-time mainstream fixture of Venezuelan politics, President Rafael Caldera, who freed Chavez from jail in 1994, giving him a big boost in legitimacy, encouraging him to run for president. So President Caldera's career was on the wane, and he actually sort of thought he could Hugo Chavez, he could tap into some of Hugo Chavez's popularity. Turned out Caldera miscalculated. Caldera's career ended up being finished, and Chavez was soon elected president. A similar story can be told about Italy in the early 1920s. Benito Mussolini was a total outcast of the mainstream. But a long-standing prominent liberal politician, Giovanni Giletti, thought he could tap into Mussolini's mass appeal and co-opt him. So he included him on an establishment liberal party list for parliamentary elections. Within a year, Mussolini was in power and Giletti was long gone. In Weimar, Germany, the leader of the German Conservative Party in the late 1920s allied himself with Hitler, issued joint proclamations, organized joint rallies. The goal was to try to tap into some of the energy of the Nazi movement, to shore up this relatively mainstream elitist party. But this backfired. Conservatives disintegrated, Hitler was elevated, and by 1933 he was in power. So in every instance, mainstream or establishment politicians opened the door, abdicated, failed in their gatekeeping function out of miscalculation or opportunism, and let the extremists in the door. And in every instance, the mainstream politician makes the same mistake. A kind of Faustian bargain. They hope to draw on the enthusiastic support for the outsider. In every instance, they think they can control the demagogue. But in every instance, the Faustian bargain backfires. The establishment politicians lose control. So the same thing happened in the United States in 2016. Republicans enabled Donald Trump. Most leading Republicans, even after candidate Trump won the nomination, openly despised him, were offended by him. They could have voted cross party lines. They could have, but didn't endorse Hillary Clinton. They could have put country ahead of party, and this could have made a difference. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, come on, is this realistic to endorse somebody from the other side? Well, I think, it's not as naive as you may think. And this, in fact, has happened in the past in other countries. In France in 2017, just a year ago. The French presidential election in 2017 is a two-round system. François Fillon, who was the Republican center-right party candidate, who everybody thought would make it into the second round, the conservative, didn't make it into the second round. And in the second round, you had Macron, the current prime minister, current president, a former cabinet minister in a socialist government, facing off against Marine Le Pen. In many ways, Marine Le Pen's program was much closer to the conservative François Fillon, the center-right candidate. François Fillon came out and endorsed Macron, and many of his voters and supported Macron, and this made a significant difference. In the United States, Republicans did not do this. They let our Le Pen in the door. Donald Trump was elected president, and once an authoritarian is in the door, it's a changed game. Pass things over to Steve. What happens next?
Thanks. Can you hear me? I like to be heard. Thanks so much for coming to at least try to hear us. So I'm responsible for Discoveries 2 and 3.
Yes.
The truth is that, I'll be honest, Daniel came up with all the discoveries. I just thought of the title of the book.
We love the title.
That's why I'm here. So the second discovery, and tell me if you're not hearing me, was that our Constitution by itself is probably not enough to save us. Americans tend to have a lot of faith in our constitutional system of checks and balances, and for pretty good reason. We have the oldest, we have the most successful Constitution on earth. And it has contained powerful, ambitious presidents in the past. But constitutions do not work automatically. If they did, the Constitution of my beloved Argentina, which was in the 19th century essentially an exact replica of the U.S. Constitution, would have enabled that new democracy to thrive, to survive. Instead, Argentina's first democracy lasted 14 years, and the country suffered 6 military coups in the 20th century. So the Constitution itself is not enough. What's written in the Constitution is not enough. We argue that constitutions work best when they're reinforced by two key democratic norms, or unwritten rules. One of them is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with, no matter how much we may dislike our partisan rivals, we recognize publicly and privately that they're loyal citizens who love the country just as we do and who have an equal and legitimate right to compete for office and to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm, and this one's a little trickier, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of self-restraint. It is an underutilization of one's power. Now, we don't often think about forbearance in politics, but it is absolutely vital. Think about what the President of the United States is constitutionally able to do. The President can pardon whomever he or she wants, whenever he or he wants. Any president with a congressional majority can pack the Supreme Court. Don't like the way the Supreme Court is ruling? If you have a majority in Congress, you can expand it to 11, to 13, and fill it with allies. Perfectly legal. Or if a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, he can circumvent the legislative process and make policy through things like executive proclamations or executive orders. The Constitution does not explicitly prohibit circumventing Congress in that way. Or think about what Congress can do. The Senate could use its right to advice and consent to block all of the president's cabinet and judicial picks. It can prevent the president from filling Supreme Court vacancies legally. Congress can, as we know, refuse to fund the government. It can effectively shut the government down. And of course, it can impeach the president basically on any grounds it chooses. My point here is simply that politicians can exploit the very letter of the Constitution in ways that can throw a democracy, even ours, into crisis. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this sort of behavior constitutional hardball, using the letter of the law in ways that undermine or eviscerate its spirit. Look at any failing democracy, now or in history, and you will find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Argentina under Perón, Spain and Germany in the 30s, contemporary Turkey, Ecuador, Venezuela, Hungary. What prevents our constitutional system from descending into deadlock, into dysfunction, and maybe even authoritarianism is forbearance. It's a shared understanding among politicians that neither side will deploy its institutional prerogatives to the hilt, that the spirit of the law will prevail over the letter of the law. We view norms of mutual toleration and forbearance as the soft guardrails of democracy. They help to prevent healthy, normal political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, American democracy has not always had these soft guardrails. Didn't have them in the 1790s when partisan intolerance and constitutional hardball nearly destroyed our new republic. And it lost them very clearly in the run-up to the Civil War. But starting in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans largely accepted one another as legitimate rivals and largely avoided destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments. There were no successful court packings. Senators were judicious in their use of filibusters and in their right to advice and consent. They largely deferred to the president on presidential appointees. And outside of wartime, presidents largely refrained from acting unilaterally to circumvent either the courts or Congress. So for more than a century, starting in the late 19th century, our checks and balances worked. But again, they worked not because of what was written down in the Constitution so much as the fact that they were reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. What we argue and hopefully show in the book is that these democratic norms have been unraveling in the United States for the last 25 or 30 years. We saw early signs of this in the 1990s with the Gingrich era government shutdowns and the partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton. But the process really got going in the 2000s. When Barack Obama ran for president, Republicans called him a Marxist, pro-terrorist, un-American. Republican leaders like Giuliani, Huckabee, Gingrich, Palin said President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. The birther movement, of course, took it a step further, questioning President Obama's very legitimacy as president. Now, America has always had an extremist fringe, as Daniel pointed out. But this wasn't fringe politics anymore. These were national Republican leaders. This was a vice presidential candidate. The Republicans nominated a prominent birther as their presidential candidate in 2016, and that candidate accused his presidential rival of being a criminal who belonged in jail. So by the 2000s, leading Republicans had begun to deny the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. They had begun to cast the Democrats as the enemy. The decline of mutual toleration, and we've seen this in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere, encourages politicians to abandon forbearance. When we come to view our partisan rivals as the enemy, as an existential threat, we become tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. Because if you believe that your rival, if he or she or they come to power, will destroy America, you're going to use every tool available to you. No more restraint, right? And that's exactly, we argue, what's beginning to happen. Politicians are throwing forbearance to the wind. Filibusters are now routine. Politicians shut down the government. They refuse to raise the debt limit a few years ago, nearly throwing us into default. We see extraordinary acts of constitutional hardball, like North Carolina's 2016 legislative coup and the Senate's 2016 refusal to allow the president to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, a move that was unprecedented since the 1860s, since the end of the Civil War. So the problem, and this is to repeat something Daniel said, is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. We did do that. The problem, the real problem, is that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were coming unmoored. So why the hell is this happening? We argue, and this is, I think, discovery number 3, that what's driving norm erosion is partisan polarization. Republicans and Democrats have grown so far apart that they now literally fear and loathe one another. In 1960, 4 or 5% of Republicans and Democrats told surveys that they would be displeased if their child married someone from another party. 4 or 5%. Today, that number is 50%, both parties. Last year, a Pew survey found that 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats said that the other party makes them afraid. We have not seen this kind of partisan hatred since the end of Reconstruction. And this is not traditional liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another about health care or taxes. They don't. Today's partisan differences run deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. Our parties have changed dramatically during our lifetimes over the last 50 years. If you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, the two parties were demographically, were culturally very similar. Both of them were overwhelmingly white and Christian. The parties differed on taxes, they differed on government spending, they may have differed on foreign policy, but on race and religion, on God and skin color, they were almost indistinguishable, certainly overlapping. 3 changes have occurred in the last 50 years. First of all, the achievements of the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic to the Republican Party, and of course the enfranchisement, belatedly, of African Americans in the South led to a migration of African Americans into the Democratic Party. Second, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration, primarily from Latin America and Asia. Most of those immigrants and their children ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, beginning under Reagan, evangelical Christians who had once been evenly distributed between the two political parties, a little more Democrat than Republican, moved overwhelmingly into the Republican Party. So by the 2000s, Democrats and Republicans were very, very different beings. They were demographically and culturally very different. The Democrats were a rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. The Republicans, by contrast, remained overwhelmingly white and Christian. That's important because white Christians are not just any group. They were once the majority, electorally, and they used to sit unchallenged atop the country's social, economic, political hierarchies. They filled the presidency, Congress, the Supreme Court. They were the pillars of local communities. They were the CEOs. They were the newscasters. They were the sports stars, the movie stars. They were the college professors. And crucially, they were the face of both the Democrat and Republican parties. Those days, obviously, are over. But losing one's majority status in a society can be deeply threatening. Many, certainly not all, but many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And we think that ultimately is what's fueling polarization in this country. The problem is that polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson that we take from the failure of democracy in Europe in the 30s, from the failure of democracy in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side sees the victory by the other side as intolerable, as beyond the pale, democracy's in trouble. When an opposition victory is viewed as something that cannot be accepted, that's intolerable, you start to justify using extraordinary means to stop them. Violence, election fraud, coups. Americans have not reached that point, obviously. But we have reached a point where, according to 2016 exit polls, 1 out of 4 Trump voters believed that he was unfit for the office of the presidency. And yet they still preferred him to the Democrat. We've reached a level where, according to Gallup, Republicans have a much more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than of Hillary Clinton. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. So Donald Trump is a challenge. But the most fundamental challenge that we face today is extreme polarization. Extreme polarization driven by a radicalized Republican Party that today represents a declining white Christian majority, many of whose members perceive themselves to face an existential threat. Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He didn't cause it. And his departure from the presidency, whether it's in 2020, 2024, or before, his departure from the presidency will not end that polarization. So quickly, what can be done? We don't know. Just want to But I'd be clear on what. It's all in the book, really. Go. But, it is clear, for one, that the Republican Party has to change. It has to become a more diverse political party. As long as the Republicans remain overwhelmingly white and Christian in a society as diverse as ours, it will be prone to extremism. But what can Democrats do? There's been a lot of talk in progressive circles recently, since Trump's election, about Democrats learning to fight like Republicans. If Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, Democrats need to learn to play tit for tat. If they don't, they will be victims of an endless series of sucker punches, stolen Supreme Court seats, and the like. And in fact, Democrats are beginning to fight like Republicans. They just used a filibuster to trigger their first ever major government shutdown. That is a page out of the Newt Gingrich playbook. Many Democrats will run on a platform of impeachment in this year's election. And if the Democrats win control of the Senate, there's talk of denying President Trump the ability to fill any additional Supreme Court vacancy, just like the Democrats did to Obama. Excuse me, sorry. You didn't know that, huh? Republicans. We worry a lot about that response. Fighting like Republicans, as understandable as it may be, will inevitably reinforce and even accelerate the process of norm erosion. It will further weaken democracy's guardrails. And in our experience studying democracies in crisis elsewhere in the world, that sort of spiral, that sort of escalation rarely ends well. So in our view, opposition to Trump, certainly to Trump's abuses, should be vigorous, it should be muscular, it can include protest, but it should be norm defending rather than norm violating. These days, forbearance is not a pretty word in American politics. Forbearance, particularly I think among Democrats, is seen as a sign of weakness. It's a sign of giving in to the other side, the giving in to the bully. But in reality, forbearance takes great political courage and strength. It often means and you don't see this much in politics today, it means standing up in front of an angry base and saying you're not going to do what they want, but you're going to do what's best for the country, or you're going to do what's best for our institutions. Republicans have systematically failed to show that kind of leadership over the last decade. I want to suggest that Democrats should not follow in their footsteps. Let me stop there, because I think I've taken too long. Thanks.
So you haven't mentioned the Koch brothers. I remember the 50s very well. I was born before that. And life was quite different then. One factory job could support the man, a wife at home, 2 children. He could buy a house. He could buy a car. He could send his kids to a public school. He had a retirement. That's gone. It was mostly for whites. The blacks weren't able to participate. I'm from New England. But you haven't talked about that. Now, the Republicans have offered a series of scapegoats. First, it was the blacks. Then, it was the immigrants. But it's not. It's the Reagan, he thought freedom meant the free market. And unions were done away with. All kinds of laws were changed. What? Do you consider that too?
Great. Thank you. Yeah. So, thank you for the question, and thanks for raising that issue. That is something we deal with. I mean, and especially in the last chapter of our book, we talk about the role of inequalities. I think you're highlighting something very important. I think in a lot of ways that these dynamics of polarization that Steve is describing that have emerged really since beginning really in the 1960s, the realignment of the parties, in some ways as a backlash against the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. I mean, that's one way of thinking about what has happened. This has been exacerbated, certainly, by growing economic inequality. I mean, it's the combination of these two things that I think is that is potentially dangerous, or that has caused this backlash. So we have to figure out ways of dealing with that. And obviously, in a book we say that one way of reducing polarization is by reducing inequality. There's a dilemma, of course, there, which is, in order to come up with the policies to address these kinds of economic problems,
our politics needs to become more functional and less polarized. But in order to become less polarized, we need to address inequality. So there's a catch-22. And there's an important role here for political leadership. Just one other point. Imagine for a moment, had the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and increases in immigration begun in 1948. And then you had 50 years of uninterrupted, basically, economic growth. We might live in a very different place. I mean, we had the kind of misfortune in some ways that these democratizing reforms that came in the late 60s were followed within several years of a transformation in the global economy and slowed economic growth rates. And so it's really that combination that I think has, that's the reality. The question is, how do our politics cope with that? So thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.
As you know, the Electoral College has historically voted in tandem with the populace vote. So my question is, what is it that the Electoral College members saw in Donald Trump that they preferred to Hillary Clinton?
Okay. There is a long established, a 200+ year-old norm in the United States that delegates vote in line with the state election. So delegates are. Alexander Hamilton imagined an electoral college full of independent, essentially local notables, who would deliberate and vote independently. That existed for a few years, disappeared. That's not the way our electoral college works in practice. The way our electoral college works in practice is simply transferring the state level outcomes into they're a rubber stamp. They're supposed to be a rubber stamp. So it's not the poor members of the electoral college's fault that Donald Trump was selected president. That's not where the problem lies. Now there are very good arguments, I think, for eliminating the electoral college. It's a very I don't think it's going to resolve all of our problems. It will prevent 40% of the last presidents have been determined by someone other than the winner of the popular vote. There's a problem with that. So I think you can make a good argument for eliminating the electoral college, but even that would not eliminate the problems of polarization that we highlight in the book. Sir.
The person who spoke second, I'm sorry, I forgot names.
Steve.
You suggested the Democrats should practice forbearance. If they do, the Republicans will just bully them more. Won't it just become a cycle and make it worse if the Democrats don't fight back with the same tactics as the Republicans?
I want to say, first of all, that this is a really tough dilemma. First of all, anytime you elect as president somebody's not fully committed to democratic rules of the game, oppositions are in a tough place, because if they put their guard down, they can get stepped on, as we've seen in many countries. But if they fight, it can often spiral even worse. So there's no easy choice. There is no easy choice for opposition. And what the Democrats have to do is take advantage of institutional opportunities. We continue to have free elections in this country. Democrats need to win the election. And when the government, that's the single best blow for democracy that the Democrats can land in the next year. The choice what to do when you get punched in the gut by a bully, when you get sucker punched, is a tough one. We have no magic bullet solution to that, none. But we have seen democracies die in every continent on Earth, except the Middle East, where there haven't been any democracies. And we've seen this movie before. The spiraling erosion of democratic norms can kill democracies, and so it's a very, very serious dilemma that Democrats face. So if they're going, it's very hard to identify the point. There is a point where you have to fight back. There is a point where opposition needs to engage in hardball. I would say that one, it needs to be deliberated seriously. That Democrats have to be very careful about that choice. And secondly, if they do it, if they employ hardball tactics, they should build the biggest possible coalition behind it. It's really important that they bring in as many actors from red states, from the Republican Party, from the private sector as possible and have it not be a partisan spiral. Because the costs of fighting back, as reasonable as it is, can be deadly for democracy in the long run.
Quick comment, then quick question. Comment is something you didn't mention that's more recent, which is that now we see Congress being faced with adopting major legislation with no public hearings, no time for deliberation and comment, and that is truly frightening. And second, my question is particularly Mr. Ziblatt. I looked for your name before.
Thank you.
You seem to use demagogue and authoritarian as the same interchangeably, although maybe it's demagoguery leads to authoritarianism. Are they the same thing, or are there some shades of gray, particularly maybe on the demagogue side?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you for the questions. So on the first point, I mean, this is something we recount in the book, because I think what you're describing, it's not the point about Congress not doing its job, in effect. I mean, that the procedures for considering legislation have changed. I mean, this is, we kind of recount this, and one way to think about this is that each of the branches of government have a certain constitutional role to play, and Congress you can think of as having a kind of guard dog role to play, which is to kind of watch for abuses of power. One thing that makes us nervous, I mean, what happens when forbearance declines, is that you kind of get this oscillation between attack dogs and lapdog Congresses. So in which, when the other party's in charge, the Congress turns into an attack dog and blocks anything from happening. And when your own party's in charge of the presidency, then the Congress turns into a lapdog and kind of protects essentially the president, doesn't do its constitutional duty. And so this dynamic is in part driven, I think, by polarization, party polarization. So that's how we kind of think about these things connecting. In terms of demagogue and authoritarian, so demagogue, is a classical Greek kind of phenomena that was written about by Thucydides. I mean, it's a tricky term, because demagogue is a representative of the people. So this sounds very democratic. I mean, all democratic politicians at some level are demagogues. But the way that people have thought about this, and theorists have written about this, and the way we think about this, is that a demagogue is somebody who responds to the whims of the people, but doesn't act in responsible ways. Now, of course, responsibility is a bit in the eye of the beholder, but there's a way in which a demagogue is one who plays to the worst instincts in the crowd. And so, we talked about the politicians needing to stand up and say at points, this is not acceptable behavior, and I'm not going to give into it, even if it's unpopular. This is not what a demagogue does. Now, the relationship between demagogues and authoritarianism, I mean, as we pointed out, one of the things that's transformed since the end of the Cold War is the way that authoritarians come to power now is often through elections. And so rather than being generals coming to power through, Pinochet in Chile coming to power through a military coup, the way authoritarians come to power is through elections, and so they often are demagogues. Okay, thank you.
So in the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in 9 states. And then during the Civil War, he suspended habeas corpus. So aren't these examples of democratic norms eroding away during the Civil War? So how are we able to overcome those? And how can we apply that today and see a difference with 2016 versus the 1860s?
This is not going to be a happy tale. And
good question, though.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, what the Civil War is a really great comparative case for us, because it's a case where if you look at political discourse, first of all, intense polarization over slavery in the 1850s, that led to a clear erosion of mutual toleration. This country was not born with mutual toleration. The Federalists and the Republicans in the 1790s considered each other traitors who were trying to destroy the Republic. But over the course of the first decades of the 19th century, the second generation, the generation that followed our founders, did establish these sort of embryonic democratic norms, including mutual toleration. It was partly invented in the United States in the early 19th century. Those norms were shattered in the polarization over slavery, particularly between the white Southern planters who ran the Democratic Party in the South and the emerging Republican Party, which was allied with the abolitionist movement. Southern Democrats, if you look at discourse in the late 1850s and around the 1860 election considered the Republicans traitors and called them that. And the and abolitionists saw the Southern Democrats the same way. So you saw a total erosion of mutual toleration and eventually the collapse of the regime. U.S. democracy broke down in the early 1860s. And in fact, the norms that collapsed remained very weak well after the Civil War. This surprised us as we did our research. 1870s, even into the 1880s, you saw really low levels of partisan tolerance between Republicans and Democrats. Keep going back to
Waving the bloody shirt.
Yeah. So how does it get resolved? It gets resolved in a tragic way. The Republicans' decision to abandon goals of racial equality, to abandon Reconstruction, to abandon efforts to enforce the recent constitutional amendments guaranteeing suffrage to African Americans in the South, and the Republicans' willingness to allow the Democrats, first of all, to strip away suffrage for African Americans, which had been granted, and to consolidate single-party authoritarian rule in the South. That is what allowed Democrats and Republicans to come together. Once Republicans allowed racial equality to be removed from the political agenda, Democrats, for the first time in 30 years, stopped seeing Republicans as an existential threat. And so mutual toleration increased, and they were able, in effect, to play nice for the first time since really the birth of the Republican Party. And so, paradoxically, tragically, the norms that were rebuilt in the late 19th century, which I mentioned, which sustained our democratic system throughout the 20th century, were built and to a large extent sustained on racial exclusion. Told you it wasn't a happy story.
Thank
So,
you.
I mean, let me just add something. I mean, I hear some of you murmuring and muttering at that answer. I mean, I think the reality is history doesn't move always in the same direction. I mean, there's ways in which, this was a tragic part of our history, and at some level, the point of our book is to try to think about how we can combine these norms of mutual toleration and forbearance with a more fully democratic society that we are today. And so that's really the challenge and the dilemma that this account that Steve just gave suggests.
Thanks for a great presentation. I liked it.
Thank you.
Found it very enlightening, and I especially liked your answer to the last question, which I found especially enlightening. So, and I appreciate the idea of what you were calling the soft guardrails and the importance of those. I guess a quick comment. It strikes me that polarization, extreme polarization, partisanship is sort of a symptom rather than a cause, and yet you sort of wanted to describe it as a cause rather than as a symptom. But here's the question that really seems even more fundamental. You're saying we can't really depend on we shouldn't count on the Constitution really to protect us here. And the specific question I have is, what are the limits of the Supreme Court and our judiciary, but our Supreme Court in particular, in using the Constitution as a protection against the worst outcomes? I don't know what happened with the Supreme Court in the Civil War, how that things played out there, but what are the limits of the court in protecting us?
That's a great question. And I'm not an expert on the U.S. judiciary, so there are limits to my answer to the question about the limits. But the Supreme Court is, historically in the United States, a small c conservative institution. It does not like to step in and rule the president's behavior unconstitutional. So one of our colleagues, a political scientist named William Howell, has written a book that shows, among other things, that I mentioned that presidents, there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly forbids the president, and in fact, President Obama did this quite a bit, if he can't get something through Congress using proclamations or presidential memos or executive orders to do what he wanted to do through Congress. That's, circumventing Congress is not good for democracy. But historically, the Supreme Court has had nothing to say about that. The Supreme Court has very rarely stepped in to say, hey, executive, you can't do that. The only time that's historically the Supreme Court will intervene and rule that the president has overstepped his bounds or her bounds is when Congress rejects what the president does. So if the president issues some sort of executive order and Congress votes that this was somehow unacceptable or shows public opposition to what the president did and there's a conflict between the two powers, then the Supreme Court will step in. If the Congress is silent, if the Congress is a lapdog, as Daniel just mentioned, the Supreme Court historically has not stepped in. Now that's self-limitation. The Supreme Court could step in. I mean, the Venezuelan Supreme Court, packed by Hugo Chavez, when the opposition gained control of the Congress in 2015, in order to protect President Maduro, ruled every single bill that the Congress passed was unconstitutional. Everything he did. Somebody got up to go to the bathroom, unconstitutional. And so the president, if the Supreme Court could engage in hardball and step in, but historically the Supreme Court has used a lot of forbearance and a lot of restraint. It has restrained itself. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, well, I would just say that in our current situation, I mean, our checks and balances, I mean, this is one of the points of our book, is despite the dark cover and the dark title, I mean, I think our checks and balances have worked pretty well. And in particular, some institutions have worked better than others, some social institutions, some political institutions. And I think the judicial branch has worked quite well. I mean, there's been effort, blocking of presidential executive orders and so on. So, I think media has worked quite well. I mean, there's been an incredible, the New York Times has tripled its subscription and so on, and media has been very active. I would say the kind of weak point in our checks and balances currently is Congress, in fact.
So, how likely is it for this demagogue to start a war in order to avoid impeachment?
Well, yeah. So I'm not. I think one thing. I mean, it's a good question. It's a good question. The reason it's a good question is that one of the things that we've noticed looking around the world is that one of the most kind of the things that we worry about, the thing that keeps us up at night, is the possibility of a crisis. And that in moments of crisis, what authoritarians, electoral authoritarians who've been slowly chipping away at the state do is they take advantage of that crisis. So Ferdinand Marcos did this in the Philippines. There's been other cases of this. Whether or not. Yeah. So
but there are cases
yes.
in which the leader invents the crisis. So the crisis that led Ferdinand Marcos to impose martial law in the Philippines was invented.
Right. So, I mean, nobody's going to impeach a president that is engaged in war.
No, it's worse than that. I mean, every time that we've been in a major security crisis, every time we've been in a major war where American lives are being lost, presidential approval shoots to the sky, right? George Bush, after the 9/11 attacks, saw his presidential approval rating reach 90 or 91%. There was a period of time in which he could do whatever he wanted. And actually, to his great credit, he exercised a lot of forbearance. He did not use that power to wield it against Democrats. He made some moves that many of us may disagree with. He did not wield that power against Democrats. So that does keep us. So don't tell any of this to the president. I cannot predict the likelihood that he will try to do this. I can't. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's certainly something to worry about.
So we can take the next
Sure.
two.
Thank you.
One over there and one over here.
For the sake of transparency, I should admit that I'm a white Christian. And I think that
I'm white too, yeah.
We're one of the reasons we're part of the problem is that extremism is institutionalized in the Congress, gerrymandering in the House, and the continuation of the Senate as a rotten borough. Now, the Congress should be the strongest opponent of an authoritarian executive, and yet its approval rating is even lower than Trump's. So can we do anything about that, such as changing redistricting?
Okay.
electoral reform is hard. I mean,
Does
for a couple of
forbearance
reasons.
go that far?
There are a couple of reasons why electoral reform is hard, and I agree with you that that there are a number of electoral reforms that would make our. There's no panacea. There's no electoral system in the world that will do away with American polarization. We shouldn't overstate the role of electoral reform or changing the rules. But you know, an awful lot of electoral innovations have taken place in the last 200 years. The reason why electoral reform is hard in our country, there are a number of reasons. One, for better and worse, we are really attached to our political institutions. You know, I don't think there's a country in the world that is still hugging its 18th century institutions more or less intact. In Europe, the electoral systems were dramatically overhauled in and around and after World War I. We are sticking with our 18th century institutions. There are positives to that. They're having strong institutions with a lot of sort of public legitimacy is beneficial. If you don't believe that, go check out politics in Argentina and Peru, where nobody believes in any institutions. But that said, we Americans are very conservative, small c, in terms of political reform. We kind of treat our institutions as sacrosanct, which probably is not a great idea. The other reason, though, is that electoral reform is always hard, is that usually one side is benefiting from the status quo. And that's certainly true with our electoral system today, including the Electoral College. If one side is benefiting, it's hard to get the consensus needed for a major overhaul of the system.
But I would just add that there are innovations taking place at the state level across the U.S., and that's very interesting to kind of, it's not in the national headlines, but, there's, in Maine, in California, and so one reform that people have talked about is, shifting power of redistricting out of the hands of state legislatures and into the hands of neutral bodies, and that's happened in California, and I think, that's something that it turns out may be a very good reform. But it's going to be happening at the state level, not at the national level.
Hi. We tend to think of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party as if they were one within each, but there's actually wide differences within each party. And those differences get played out pretty nastily in the primaries. And then there's the Independent Green Party and other parties. Do you see on our horizon a splintering of the Democrats and Republicans? Do you see movements toward the left and toward the right, and then possibly crossover in the center? And what effect would that have on democracy in America?
You guys keep asking us to forecast. Political scientists are notoriously bad at predicting the future. So I'm going to give this one to Dan.
Yeah, no. Well, I guess one thing I would say is that, given our electoral system, we're likely to continue to have two parties. What will be inside those two parties may change. I mean, at different moments in American history, there's been a realignment of parties, like the one we've just described, where Southern Democrats migrated to the Republican Party. I mean, I think it's there's the possibility that the current dynamic, where you have moderate Republicans, still maybe calling themselves Republicans, potentially joining with the Democrats. This may, who knows? It's hard to know how these things will play out. But I think but on the other hand, the Democratic Party, there's certainly lots of energy on the left of the Democratic Party now, to a degree that there hasn't been in a very long time. So, as Steve said, it's hard to predict. But it's not one thing I guess I can predict is that realignment does happen, and so it's likely to continue to happen. What form it'll take, I'm not sure.
Let me just add one point, which is that our parties we're a very diverse country, a big, heterogeneous, diverse country. And because of the electoral system, we have a two-party system. Because of that, inevitably, both parties are internally heterogeneous. It's impossible for two parties to represent the enormous diversity of this country without being big tents. But historically, our parties have been much more internally divided than they are today. I don't think our parties have ever, particularly the Republicans, have ever been as homogeneous as they are these days. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the Democrats had a liberal wing up here in the Northeast. They had a very conservative wing in the South. The Republicans had, Goldwater Republicans, and they had liberals up in New England. There was a big gap within the parties. Those gaps have been dramatically reduced. So yes, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton fight it out. Primaries are competitive and people throw things at each other. But The parties are actually much more homogeneous than they were in the past, internally.
If we move quickly, we can take this one last question over here.
In 2008, 12, and 16, 60 million Republicans showed up. In comparison, 70 million, 65 million, 60 million Democrats showed up. Are Democrats fickle? Do they have feet of clay? That's one. So two, then what do you do about getting people to show up? Like, why does there have to be what appears to be a standard by which if somebody doesn't meet this level, I'm just going to stay home?
I'll say something. Yeah, so one thing to think about with people turning out to vote, I mean, it's easy to blame voters directly themselves, and voters, of course, are responsible to vote. But the reality is parties mobilize voters, and parties mobilize voters through groups. It's much more efficient to mobilize a group and then get those people to turn out. And so, there's a recent study that's come out with the National Bureau of Economic Research, which shows that in states that have open shop laws, so in other words, unions are not required, where they've adopted these laws, unions are weaker, and voter turnout declines, and Democratic vote declines. And so the weakening of social groups and civic society groups, I think, is one plays an important role. So this is, what can be done. I mean, one solution based on the findings of this paper. This is just one. There's many answers to this question, but one answer is focus on building up groups, because groups mobilize voters, and parties need to be linked to groups. And so it's hard, boring organizational work, but that's the reality.
Let me just take that point very briefly in a very depressing direction if you're a Democrat. Sorry. I just, it's my mood today. In any small town in the country, you can think about red states or rural areas, in any town, anywhere in this country, you have two organizations, two groups, as Daniel put out, that work, that bring out votes. Because Daniel's right, political science research shows that people do not just watch television, get up and vote. Some of us do. But people have to be mobilized by somebody, by organizations. In every small town in this country, in every state, there are Christian churches and there are NRA branches. That is a powerful infrastructure of electoral mobilization for the Republican Party. What do the Democrats have? They used to have unions. They were about a third of the strength that they were in the 1950s, and there's nothing else. What Democrat? Maybe. Are women? I wish, but are women organized in every small town in Nebraska the way the NRA is? I would submit they are not.
Getting there, though. I mean, there's something, but I mean,
Daniel's going to offer a closing word of hope.
Yeah, he's the pessimist, I'm the optimist. This is usually our roles here. So, the Women's March last year, the Women's March this year, and the kind of media focuses on it as a one-time event. But I think that, the idea that there's the possibility of new political leaders, I mean, I think the most important, it turns out the abolitionist movement, one of the main a kind of legacy of the abolitionist women were involved with the abolitionist movement, and this gave rise to women's voting rights. I mean, these are the same people who get activated in one set of struggles turns to another set of struggles. And I think in a similar way, the kind of light that I see, the positive side of this that I see, is that these marches generate a new generation of political leaders and people running for office, and there's evidence that this is happening. And so this is a new dynamic, in fact. And so, who knows? We'll see. Keep an eye on this.
Thank you. Those are great questions.
Yeah, thank you.
So